To Ms.Carmina Reads Live. I'm Ms. Carmina, and this is my channel, Ms. Carmina Reads. Please subscribe if you want to see me again. Go ahead and give me a thumbs up if you want to support what I do or if you like this video. And I appreciate any other support you want to give me if you want to send me gems or super chat, but also consider joining the channel so you can get access to all of my videos. Today, we are reading the Epicureans, Gateway to the Epicureans, Epicurus, Lucretius, and their modern heirs. I will begin again the letter to Herodotus. Diogenes Laertius 10.34-84. This letter outlines Epicurus' main principles of logic and physics, arguing that everything is either atoms or void. Modern readers will be interested to find here and in the next letter a theory of many worlds. This is a precursor to a multiverse theory, motivated by many of the same concerns. If atoms and the law of physics explain everything, and if the order of our world is not the product of divine forethought, then many or even all possible worlds must come into being by chance. See further the third passage from Lucretius in this collection. Epicurus to Herodotus. Greetings. For those Greetings. For those Herodotus who can carefully examine each point that he wrote out in our books on nature, or make a thorough study of the longer books we've written on the subject, I myself have prepared a summary of the whole subject, designed to provide a summation of all the major points in outline to help them jog their own memories on the most pertinent points in each of the topics, whenever they should touch on a theory of nature. And even for those who are more advanced in their study of the whole topic, it's still quite necessary to refer back to a point-for-point outline of the entire subject and get a reminder of the shape of the thing. After all, we often need an overview of the whole subject gathered together, less often the parts one by one. Well then, we have to return constantly to each of the main principles and fix them so firmly in our memory that our approach to the details will be utterly sound, and even the finer points will be clearly elucidated as part of the whole once we have grasped the shape of the thing overall and memorized its outline. Since even for a highly accomplished student, the most reliable source of clarity in every particular is to be able to refer precisely to the first principles so as to relate each issue to its arrangement in the whole and apply the appropriate terminology. For no one can take in full view of all the parts gathered into an orderly array unless he can sum up with the whole thing in itself and express with simple words what would be divided up into parts. In view of which, since this approach is helpful for all those engaging in the study of nature and science, I myself pursue the study with diligence and enthusiasm, having attained serenity through this kind of pursuit more than any other. I've made for you just such a summary and outline of all the main ideas. Wow. ASMR if you want it to be. Hello, Side. I am in California. Let's read. Hey, Captain Homer, you're not enjoying this? I think you would with that name. In view of which, since its approach is helpful for all those engaging with the study of nature, and since I myself pursue that study with diligence and enthusiasm, having attained serenity through this kind of pursuit through more than any other, I have made for you just such a summary and outline of all the main ideas. First of all, then, Herodotus it's crucial to grasp what is designated by the relevant terms, so that by referring to them, we can evaluate the ideas being proposed or examined, or called into doubt, and so as not to be drawn into redundant demonstrations ad infinitum, or saddled with meaningless terms. It's essential that the primary ideas we work with each be known by simple terms requiring no further demonstration, which is how we will get a reference point to which we can refer whatever is being examined or doubted or proposed. Next, it's necessary to scrutinize thoroughly our sensory experiences and all our present impressions more generally, whether in mind or from some other source of knowledge, and likewise all existing feelings, so we have a means of drawing inferences about what is not evident and what has yet to be confirmed. Proceeding in this manner, we need next to take stock of the principles concerning what is not evident. First, nothing comes out of what doesn't exist. For if no source were necessary to produce things, anything could arise out of anything. And if anything were to disappear and be consumed by non-existence, all things whatsoever would be destroyed, since they would be resolved into component parts that do not exist. Indeed, the sum total of all things was always the same as it is now, and it will always be the same, for there is nothing into which it can change. Besides the sum total, there is nothing. Besides the sum total, there is nothing. So it can't transition into anything to make a change. Moreover, and he says this also near the beginning of the longer survey and his book on nature. The sum total is bodies and empty space. Since perception itself bears witness to the existence of bodies, by these same means we are compelled to reason about what is not evident using sensory indicators. If there did not exist that other aspect of nature which we designate by the name emptiness and vacuum and intangible, then bodies would have no place through which to move, but they do appear to move. Besides these two things, nothing can be conceived either by cognition or something analogous to cognition, that is, when bodies and emptiness are grasped as essential natures in themselves, rather than spoken or aspects of inessential features of something else. Among bodies, then, and he says this in the first book on nature, as well as in the 14th and 15th of larger survey, some are compounds and others are what the compounds are made of. This is to say, they are invisible and unchangeable elements. Otherwise, all things would be doomed to dissolve into non-existence. Instead, the elements endure securely throughout the decomposition of compounds, since they are solid by nature and have no place or way to be dissolved. The result is that all primary entities must necessarily be invisible bodies by nature. Moreover, the sum total of all things is infinite, for what is finite has a limit, and the limit is discerned by comparison to something else. Where there is no limit, there is no beyond. So the sum total of things having no beyond is limitless and infinite. Next, the sum total of things is infinite in the quantity of its bodies and in its volume of empty space. For if the void were infinite, but the bodies were of finite number, the bodies would not stay in one place, but be carried around and scattered through the infinite emptiness, with no one and nothing to oversee or arrange them by any manner of restraint. And if the emptiness were circumscribed, the infinite bodies would have no space to occupy and nowhere to be. Thank you. It may be added that those bodies which are indivisible and solid, the atoms from which compounds are made into which they are dissolved, are inconceivably varied in their shapes. It is not possible that so much variety could have been formed out of the same shapes, and for each shape there is completely limitless numbers of bodies with the identical shape, though the number of types of shape is not completely unlimited, only impossible to conceive. For he says later that they are not infinitely divided, adding, since the qualities change, unless one intends to multiply their masses infinitely. And the atoms are in perpetual continuous motion, he says below that they also move with equal speed, since empty space gives way for the weightiness and the lightness of them equally. Some are separated from each other by great distance, whereas others vibrate in place whenever they find themselves locked in a bond or entangled and subsumed into other bonded structures. The conditions for these interactions are furnished by the nature of empty space, which separates each atom individually and cannot provide it with any resistance, and the solidity which is inherent in the atoms causes them to rebound upon collision, whether for a short or long distance, and find themselves bound in a compound again. These motions have no beginning, since both atoms and void are everlasting. He says below that the atoms exhibit no qualities except for shape, size, and weight, arguing in the 12 basic principles that color is a result of the atoms' changing arrangement. And he says that they are not of every size, at least no atom has ever been detected by direct sense perception. And that's definitely true. Once these terms are repeated at length and committed to memory, they will provide an outline, a sufficient foundation for contemplating all existing entities in nature. Now, worlds are also limitless. Some of them are like this one, others are unlike. For the atoms are limitless, as was just demonstrated, and they are continually being carried further and further. The kinds of atoms necessary to make or give birth to a world are never used up, either in one world or in a limited number of them, whether they are like ours or different. It follows that there is nothing to prevent an unlimited number of worlds. And furthermore, there are shapes in the same outline as those of solid objects, though they far surpass the perceptible things in thinness. For no such composition is impossible to form the surrounding space, nor are the conditions unsuitable for the creation of thin and hollow emanations, which flow forth and maintain the same strictly ordered arrangement as the solid atoms have. These emanated shapes are what we call images, and indeed, their trajectory through the void, if they meet with no opposition from any body moving in a different direction, can cover any conceivable distance in an unthinkably short time. For slowness and speed corresponds to resistance and its absence. But in terms of time intervals that can be conceived and discussed in theory, the moving body does not arrive simultaneously at multiple places. That would be inconceivable. But in time, as we perceive it, the image is both here and there at once without any delay, even if it is not arriving from the place where we perceive it to be. For delay would amount to resistance, even if up to this point we allow that its trajectory has met with no resistance. This is, in general, a useful point to bear in mind. The fact that the images possess an unsurpassed thinness is not contradicted by any observed phenomena, from which it follows that they have an unsurpassed speed, since they always have space sufficient to pass through in limitless quantities without hitting up against anything, or only a few things, even where many or even all atoms would bump into something right away. Next, consider that the creation of images happens as quickly as thought, for the flow of images from the surface of bodies is continuous, and the bodies do not seem to shrink, because the images are immediately replaced, retaining for a long while the arrangement of solid objects and the order they acquired from the atoms, even if sometimes there is a slight confusion. These images are formed quickly in the surrounding air because they do not need it to maintain the density of solid bodies, and certain other conditions are productive of similar effects. After all, nothing in our perceived experience contradicts these claims. If one considers the vivid impressions and experiences that are conferred upon us from outside of ourselves, we must also conclude that we see and consider things when something comes into us from outside. For our surroundings would not impress the contours, colors, and forms of their own constitution upon us through the air between us and them, nor through rays of light or some kind of fluid coming out of us to them, but rather from certain shapes coming into our sight or thought from the things outside of us, in such a way as to retain the same colors and forms in the appropriate proportions, making swift use of the necessary pathways, and then furnishing by this means an appearance of one unitary and consistent thing. Retaining all the interconnections of the atom in the underlying object by way of proportional impact according to the density and the vibration of the atoms, which appearance, if we appreciate it directly in the mind or through the sensory organs, either with regard to its form or its incidental attributes, will be the same form as that of the solid object, arising out of the compounding or residue of the images. False claims and contradictions, by contrast, always consist in judgments of assent or dissent added on to perceptions, which, when they are either not yet confirmed or contradicted by sense impressions, according to certain motions in us ourselves associated with the appearance impressing itself upon us, but diverging from it in some way by which it becomes false. And the resemblance of such appearance as we experience in artistic depiction or encounter in dreams or other forms of mental apprehension or from the other sources of impressions would never resemble truly existent things if there were not some other such thing we had encountered. That is, ideas that are contradicted by experience would not exist if we did not take some foreign motion within that is associated with the appearances that impress themselves upon us, through it diverges from them in some way, though it diverges from them in some way. And by this means, if our assertion is either not attested by sense impressions or contradicted by them, there is falsehood. If, on the other hand, it is attested or not contradicted, there is truth. Indeed, it's the most important. It is of the most important. Indeed, it's of the utmost importance to hold firm these convictions, so as not to reject sources of truth that are based on manifest evidence, or to let misconceptions reinforced as if true cause all manner of disturbance. Say that twice. So then, hearing also takes place when a stream is carried from one source that is speaking, resonating, booming, or otherwise making noise in some way, and produces a sensation. This stream is distributed among particles of like mass, each of which simultaneously retains an affinity with the others and a unity within itself. Each one has a connection to the original source, and so can produce the relevant perception in itself just as well as a multitude, or, failing that, can indicate an external source of the impression. For without some mutual interaction to carry the impression from that source, this form of perception would never occur. Not that it's necessary to think of the air itself being shaped by the voice, or anything else of that nature, as it issues forth. Air is not remotely susceptible to that kind of influence. Rather, Whenever we produce a sound, an impact made within us instantly produces a corresponding stream of breathy pressure, transmitted through small masses, which produces the sensation of hearing in us. Likewise, odor should be thought of similarly to sound. No impression would ever be formed if external objects did not emit certain masses with the appropriate properties to stimulate the sensory organ, some of them chaotically and disjointedly, others smooth and pleasingly. Also, it must be believed that atoms have no qualities such as belong to the perceptive phenomena except for shape, weight, magnitude, and whatever else necessary pertains to the nature of shape. For every quality changes, but the atoms never change in any way. Since something is solid and indestructible, has to stay the same throughout the decomposition of compounds, something that will keep changes from moving into non-existence or out of it, making them consist instead of the rearrangement of multiple elements or the addition and subtraction of a few units, which means that by necessity the things being rearranged must be imperishable and without any shadow of change by nature, possessing mass and shape simply in themselves. Such things will necessarily endure. Even those things that from our perspective are taken to change shape by giving off particles, we grasp that the shape endures in the thing that is changing, while the qualities do not, since the shape persists, but the qualities arise out of the whole body and are destroyed within it. So what remains is sufficient to account for differences among the compounds, since something must necessarily be left and not decompose into nothingness. But no one should be under the impression that atoms can have just any size. If he is, he will directly he will be directly contradicted by the observable phenomena. We should think that the atoms as exhibited also, we should think that, excuse me. Hi, Jagu66666. We should think of the atoms as exhibiting a limited range of variation in size. This will also produce a better assessment of the evidence of our senses provide and the actual impression we get of what happens. Imagining just any size at all to exist would not help to explain the actual difficulties and qualities, and if there were atoms of all sizes, then some visible ones would have reached us, which has never been observed, nor is it even possible to conceive of a visible atom coming into existence. Thank you everybody for your thumbs up, for the gems, or any support. Subscribe if you want to see me again. In addition, it should be imagined that within a limited body, it is impossible to store unlimited masses, however small. So not only is it unsuitable to imagine infinite division into ever smaller pieces, so that we do not make everything totally impotent and force existing things into non-existence by grinding them down into nothing within the way we conceive of compounds, but we also must not imagine that the empty spaces within limited bodies can be subdivided infinitely into smaller and smaller increments. For there is no way to conceive if someone should ever claim that some object is comprised of unlimited masses, however small, where the object's dimensions would ever stop. For clearly, the unlimited masses would be of some defined size, and whatever size that might be, the overall dimensions would be limitless. It must be granted that limited bodies have boundaries and endpoints, even if they cannot be observed, and it is impossible not to conceive of another such object next to that one, and another one next to that. And in this way, by counting to add bodies to each other, it is possible to proceed in thought on to infinity. This is suggesting that there are infinite amounts of universes. That is the suggestion. Hi Jagu, I am reading, so gather around and listen. We should think of the smallest bodies visible to our perception as not altogether the same as those that we call as those that we can travel across, one region at a time, but not altogether dissimilar either, so that they have certain things in common, except that the smallest bodies have no parts. But when we think that through a kind of resemblance in common between these two types, we can divide the smallest bodies into parts here and there, we must actually be considering another body of equal size. We consider these smallest things one by one, starting with the first and not occupying the same place or touching one another at any part, but each one serving as a unit of the overall magnitude, which is greater if there are more of them and smaller if there are fewer. We will have to think by means of this analogy about what pertains to the atom, for it is clear that it differs from things that can be perceived by the senses in being vastly more minute, but we can consider it by analogy. It was by this analogy that we showed the atom to have size in the first place, projecting small things onto a larger scale. So we must imagine the smallest possible distance as a pure limit of all lengths and the standard by which to measure the larger and smaller atoms, outlining with rational theory what cannot be seen. For the similarity that exists between atoms and objects without any gaps is sufficient for these purposes, but these smallest micro-objects could not form compounds even if they could move. Now, we must not propose that the infinite has a highest or lowest point, an up or a down, but we know that motion upwards from where we stand into the space above our heads, which can be extended into infinity, can never appear to us identical with motion conceived as downward from our point of reference, as being both upward and downward at once. This would be impossible to conceive of. If we can consider one infinite line of motion upward and one downward, even if we have watched countless times as an object that moves upward from our perspective passes our head and reaches the feet of someone above us, or an object moving below our feet reaches the head of someone above us, for all relative motion can be thought of just the same as infinite in either direction. Moreover, atoms must all necessarily move with equal speed whenever they travel through empty space and encounter no resistance. The heavy ones should not be thought of as faster than the smaller and lighter ones, so long as nothing opposes them, nor should small ones be considered faster than the large ones. Each one possesses an equivalent motion so long as they find a passage large enough for them, irrespective of any upward or lateral motion which they acquire through collisions, or downward motion which comes from their own weight. To the extent that an atom persists on any path, it moves as fast as thought until something collides with it outside of the weight of the atom itself overcomes the influence of some applied force. And this force could be observation, no? Our observation in itself is a force. If we think back to Alice in Quantum Lands, perhaps. Yes, I will finish this another day. But let's continue a little bit longer. But when it comes to compounds, some will move faster than others, though the atoms within them move with equal speed. This is because atoms in a conglomerate move towards the same place in the shortest continuous interval of time, even if the mind cannot grasp the size of one such interval. But they are packed so close together that so far as the senses can perceive it, their collisions register as continuous motion. The additional assumption about what cannot be observed, that intervals of time marked out in theory will exhibit continuous motion, is not true when it comes to things like this. Everything that can be reasoned out in theory or perceived directly is true. Next, we ought to survey what evidence is furnished by our senses and their impressions, since that is how we will obtain the most securely persuasive evidence to the effect that the soul is a body composed of very fine parts distributed throughout the whole mass of the body, most closely resembling a breath with a certain measure of thermal energy mixed in, resembling breath in one way and heat in another. But there is one part of it that surpasses the others in thinness of its particles, which is therefore more finely tuned in sync with the rest of the body. All the soul's abilities make this part manifest, as do its sensations, its healthy functioning, and everything whose loss amounts to death. It is also a necessary proposition that the soul possesses a greater part of all sense perception, though it would not perceive if it weren't encased in the rest of the body in some way. And the rest of the body, furnishing the conditions of perception, in turn receives the cause of its sense perception furnished by its delicate part of the soul, having itself a certain sympathy with that part, though not obtaining full extent of its powers. This is why when the soul departs, the remaining body has no sensation, for it did not achieve the power of perception in itself, but was furnished with it through the congenital alignment with something else, which by way of its complementary power communicated sense experience directly to the rest of the body through motion. As soon as the soul's particles attains this sensitivity to perception, it distributed it through the rest of the body by virtue of its alignment and interconnectedness with it, as I said. Consequently, when the soul is pressed in the body, it will never lose sensation, no matter what other parts might be lost. Even if some region of the soul should be lost when the flesh enveloping it should be destroyed, in whole or in part, if the soul overall remains, so will sense perception. This is reminding me of ghost limbs. But when the last mass of atoms possessing the nature of the soul, however thinly stretched, finally departs, then the remaining body parts, both collectively and individually, will have no sense perception. And indeed, when the whole mass of the body is destroyed, the soul is scattered and no longer has the same abilities or moves in the same way, so that it achieves no sentience. It's impossible to maintain the same sensory faculty in Heirs if the atoms are no longer in the same arrangement and no longer possess the same motion. When the parts that held it together and encased it within which structure it has those movements are no longer the same. He says in his other writings that the soul is composed of the smoothest and roundest atoms, in both respects far surpassing fire, and there is a part of it that has no rational faculties, which is spread throughout the rest of the body, but the rational part is in the chest cavity, as is clear from fears and joys. Sleep occurs when the parts of the soul that are distributed throughout the whole body, the whole bodily compound, are either stopped up or dispersed, and then collide with one another upon impact. And semen comes from every part of the body. All right, indeed. All right, I will earmark this and we will continue tomorrow. Thank you for joining me, readers and scholars. I invite you to hype this video, share it with your friends. I invite you to subscribe to my channel, to join my channel. I invite you to join us again. I hope to see you again. Love you, readers and scholars. Be safe.